Early 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. American forces are pushing deep into the heart of Germany, exhausted, battered, but expecting the end of a long, brutal war. They approach a quiet, unassuming town. From the windows, church steeples, and rooftops, white sheets flutter in the freezing wind. It is the universal sign of surrender, the signal that the fighting here is finished. The dying is over. The American soldiers lower their rifles. They exhale. They step out from behind their armor and walk into the narrow cobblestone streets. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. Without warning, the eerie silence shatters. Gunfire erupts. It doesn't come from military trenches or fortified bunkers. It comes from the living rooms, from the attics, from the very houses flying the white flags. American soldiers drop to the frozen earth. It is a calculated ambush, a deadly deception orchestrated by a desperate, cornered enemy. When the news of the betrayal reaches the command tent of General George S. Patton, the air goes cold. His response isn't standard military doctrine. He doesn't just want to take the town. He wants to break the spirit of every single German city standing between his army and Berlin. What happened next was not a battle. It was a warning. Spring 1945. The Allied war machine has finally pierced the borders of Germany proper. For the American G is slogging through the mud and freezing rain. The end of the war feels agonizingly close. The German army is a shattered remnant of its former self. Their supply lines are severed. Their Luftwaffe is entirely swept from the skies. To any rational military mind, the conflict is over. But the Third Reich is not rational. It is a decaying beast, and in its death throes, its teeth are sharper than ever. Deep beneath the bombed-out ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler refuses to accept reality. Instead of sparing his people, he condemns them. He issues a chilling, uncompromising directive. There will be no retreat. There will be no capitulation. Hitler begins designating ordinary, picturesque German towns and cities as Festungen, fortresses. By standard military definition, a fortress is a heavily armed military installation. But in the paranoid, apocalyptic vision of the late-stage Nazi regime, a Festung is simply a death sentence for its inhabitants. The order is absolute. These towns must be held to the last man, the last bullet, and the last drop of blood. To enforce this suicidal mandate, the regular Wehrmacht soldiers, many of whom are exhausted veterans who know the war is lost, are pushed aside. Command of these towns is frequently handed over to the fanatics, hardcore SS officers, ruthless Nazi party officials known as Gauleiters, even brainwashed teenagers from the Hitler Youth, clutching Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, convinced that dying for the Führer is the highest possible glory. This creates a terrifying, agonizing paradox within the towns themselves. The civilians, the mothers, the children, the old men, can hear the distant, terrifying rumble of American Sherman tanks echoing through the valleys. They know what is coming. They just want to survive. In desperate bids for life, ordinary citizens begin hanging white bedsheets, tablecloths, and pillowcases from their windows. But the fanatic commanders are watching. Under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, roving military tribunals, the Fliegende Standgerichte, patrol the streets. Their orders are merciless. Anyone attempting to surrender, anyone displaying a white flag, is immediately labeled a defeatist and a traitor. Civilians are dragged from their homes. They are shot in the town squares. They are hanged from lampposts with crude cardboard signs strung around their necks reading, "I betrayed my country." Because of this fanaticism, peaceful German towns are rapidly transformed into something far more sinister. They become psychological minefields. They become death traps. For the advancing American soldiers, every single village on the map becomes a deadly game of Russian roulette. When they look through their binoculars and see white flags draped over the balconies, they can no longer trust their own eyes. Is the town genuinely surrendering? Are the civilians finally free of their Nazi captors? Or are the fanatics waiting in the shadows, using the white flags as bait, preparing to bleed the Americans for every single inch of cobblestone? The silence is heavy. It isn't the silence of peace. It is the silence of a held breath. For the lead scouts of the American infantry, the final 100 yards into the town are the longest walk of their lives. Their boots crunch against the frost-covered road. Their eyes dart frantically from rooftop to rooftop. The white flags are everywhere, flapping harmlessly in the wind. But the streets are completely, unnervingly deserted. Inside the homes, a suffocating terror grips the residents. Families huddle in their cellars, praying the Americans will simply march through. But upstairs, standing right over their heads, the fanatics have taken their positions. SS holdouts, die-hard Hitler youth, and radicalized local militias have barricaded the doors, smashed the glass out of the living room windows, and rested the barrels of their weapons on the sills. They are using the homes of their own people as human shields. The Americans step past the first row of houses. They lower their guard just for a fraction of a second. Then, the trap springs. The terrifying, mechanical rip of an MG-42 machine gun, known to the GIs as Hitler's buzzsaw, shatters the quiet. A hail of armor-piercing bullets tears through the American formation. Instantly, the street becomes a slaughterhouse. Men dive for cover behind burned-out cars and rubble, but the crossfire is perfectly coordinated. The ambush isn't coming from military bunkers. The gunfire is erupting from the local bakery, from the second-story bedrooms of family homes. A church tower, historically a place of sanctuary, flashes with the unmistakable backblast of a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket. For the American G I pinned down in the freezing mud, a terrifying new reality sets in. The traditional rules of war have just been violently erased. They are trained to shoot at uniforms, to attack trenches. But how do you fight an enemy that has weaponized a civilian neighborhood? When a muzzle flash sparks from a living room window, who is pulling the trigger? Is it a hardened SS killer? Is it a brainwashed 14-year-old boy? Or is an entire civilian family cowering just inches away from the shooter? The Americans cannot tell. In the chaos of urban combat, the line between combatant and civilian dissolves into dust. Hesitation in war equals death, and the Americans are hesitating. The casualty reports begin to mount. Medics scream for covering fire as they try to drag wounded men from the kill zones in the open streets. A routine occupation of a surrendered town has just devolved into a meat grinder. The infantry is bogged down, bleeding out, and locked in a brutal guerrilla street fight they were never meant to fight. The situation is rapidly spiraling out of control, and the news of this massacre under a white flag is making its way up the chain of command, straight to the desk of a man who does not tolerate deception. Miles behind the bleeding edge of the front line, the atmosphere inside the command post of the United States Third Army is electric. Telephones ring incessantly. Telegraph machines clatter. A massive map of Germany dominates the room, covered in red and blue grease pencil markings showing the relentless, unstoppable momentum of the American advance. Standing over this map is General George S. Patton. Patton is a man who lives for the purity of conventional warfare. He understands tank columns, sweeping flanking maneuvers, and the clash of massive armies in the open field. He believes in momentum, and he believes in the honor of the soldier. Then the radio crackles. A frantic, breathless report comes through the static from the frontline commanders. It is not a report of a Panzer Division counterattack. It is not a request for a strategic envelopment. It is a desperate plea for help from an infantry unit pinned down in a quiet civilian town. The report details the ambush, the weaponized houses, the dead and wounded American boys bleeding out on cobblestone streets beneath the mocking flutter of white flags. The room goes dead silent. The staff officers watch their commander. Patton's infamous temper is legendary, but in this moment he does not erupt into a screaming rage. Instead, his demeanor shifts into something far more dangerous. It crystallizes into a cold, calculating, and absolute fury. To a military purist like Patton, the white flag is sacred. It is the ultimate symbol of the rules of armed conflict. To use it as bait, to hide behind the skirts of a surrender to murder his men, is not just a breach of tactics, it is an unforgivable war crime. Patton leans over the map, staring at the pin representing the small, treacherous town. His brilliant tactical mind instantly connects the dots. He understands exactly what he is looking at. This is not a standard defensive line. This is a deliberate, psychological virus engineered by a dying regime. Hitler's commanders know they cannot defeat the Third Army in a fair fight. So, they have changed the game. They are relying on American morality. They are counting on the G1s to hesitate, to try and spare the civilian infrastructure, and to bleed themselves dry in slow, agonizing, house-to-house guerrilla combat. If Patton allows his men to fight on these terms, the American death toll will be catastrophic. Every single town on the road to Berlin will become a slaughterhouse. The turning point has arrived. Patton realizes a terrifying truth. You cannot negotiate with a suicide cult. You cannot fight fanatic resistance with standard infantry assaults. If the Nazi zealots want to break the rules of war to inflict pain, Patton is going to rewrite the rules of war to ensure they never try it again. The traditional playbook is thrown out the window. It is time to send a message so loud, so violently clear, that it will echo through every remaining stronghold in the Third Reich. Patton issues his new orders. There will be no mass infantry charge into the kill zones. There will be no blind, indiscriminate artillery barrage leveling the entire town into a sea of ash. He is not going to destroy the city just to save it. Instead, he unleashes a masterclass in psychological and tactical dominance. First comes the ultimatum. A message is delivered to the town, slicing through the freezing winter air. It is a promise, utterly devoid of mercy. Surrender the town immediately, unconditionally, and without deception, or face the full, unbridled wrath of the United States Armored Divisions. The town is given a ticking clock. Inside the barricaded buildings, the fanatics sneer. They are deeply entrenched. They believe the Americans will blink. They believe the American commander will eventually send his boys back into the narrow streets to bleed, trying to preserve the town's architecture. The clock runs out. The Americans do not blink. Instead of sending vulnerable flesh and blood back into the sniper-infested alleys, Patton deploys a heavy shock force. The ground begins to tremble. The terrifying mechanical screech of steel tank treads against cobblestone echoes through the valley. A vanguard of M4 Sherman tanks, backed by heavily armored tank destroyers, rolls up to the very edge of the town limits. They do not fire wildly into the air. They do not call in heavy bombers to drop payloads onto the roofs of innocent families. They execute a terrifying new doctrine: targeted destruction. The American gunners systematically identify the exact points of resistance. Is there a sniper hiding in the church bell tower? The heavy steel turret of a Sherman slowly, methodically rotates. A 76mm high-explosive shell is fired with pinpoint, devastating accuracy. The bell tower vanishes in a deafening explosion of pulverized brick and smoke, while the rest of the church stands completely untouched. Is there an MG-42 machine gun nest firing from the second-story bedroom of a corner bakery? A tank destroyer lines up the shot. A deafening roar, a blinding flash of fire, and the entire front wall of the bakery is blown outward into the street. The machine gun goes silent forever. The houses immediately next door are left perfectly intact. This is not random violence. This is surgical, overwhelming brutality. It is psychological warfare delivered directly through the barrel of a tank gun. Patton is putting on a horrific, awe-inspiring display of supreme power. He wants every civilian trembling in their cellar to feel the walls shake. He wants them to understand that the American military possesses the power to erase their town from the map in an hour, but is actively, deliberately choosing to spare them if the resistance stops. More importantly, he wants to violently shatter the minds of the Nazi holdouts. The fanatics suddenly realize their trap has failed. Their civilian human shields are utterly useless against direct-fire high explosives. Their barricaded doors offer no protection against armor-piercing shells. There will be no glorious, heroic standoff in the streets. There is only the cold, mechanical reality of being instantly vaporized by a 30-ton war machine. The message is written in fire, smoke, and shattered stone. If you shoot at us from a house, we will remove the house. Patton has flipped the psychological script. He has taken the fear the fanatics tried to inflict on his men, multiplied it by 1,000, and shoved it directly down their throats. The relentless, terrifying display of power doesn't last for days or weeks. It is not a grinding siege of attrition. The impact is almost immediate. Within just a matter of hours, perhaps a day at most, the psychological dam bursts. The targeted destruction shatters the resolve of the fanatic defenders completely. The Hitler Youth boys drop their Panzerfausts and run crying for their mothers. The SS holdouts and Gauleiters realize they are completely trapped. Their ideology, built on superiority and dominance, collapses the moment it meets the overwhelming, precision-guided violence of the United States Third Army. They wanted a glorious stand in the streets, but they are met with the blunt force of tanks, simply vaporizing their strongholds, one by one. The fighting halts abruptly. The terrifying rumble of the Sherman tanks idles down. Slowly, tentatively, the real white flags appear. This time, there is no trap. There is no ambush waiting behind the fabric. The German defenders, those who survived the surgical strikes on their barricades, stumble out into the streets with their hands held high in the freezing air. They are broken men, covered in brick dust, their fanaticism thoroughly beaten out of them. They are rapidly disarmed and marched away as prisoners of war. But the most profound result is not what happens to the soldiers. It is what happens to the civilians. As the dust settles over the specific buildings Patton ordered destroyed, the doors to the surviving cellars slowly creak open. Ordinary citizens emerge, trembling, terrified, blinking into the harsh daylight. They look around their town. Yes, a church tower is gone. A corner shop is a smoldering crater. A barricaded house is reduced to rubble. But the town itself still stands. The vast majority of the homes, the schools, the local markets, they are untouched. The people who were used as bait, who were trapped between a fanatical death cult and an advancing army, are still breathing. Patton's brutal, calculated response achieved exactly what he designed it to do. By violently amputating only the infected parts of the town, he forced a rapid capitulation. The fighting ceased entirely. The American infantry, previously pinned down and bleeding, marches through the secured streets with virtually no further casualties. By using overwhelming fear and targeted destruction in a terrifyingly short burst, Patton broke the psychological deadlock. He didn't just save his own men from a bloody, house-to-house meat grinder. In a dark, twisted way, he saved the town from completely destroying itself. The fanatic commanders lost their grip, and thousands of civilian lives that would have been lost in a protracted urban siege were spared. The immediate threat was extinguished, but the implications of Patton's actions rippled far beyond the borders of that single German town. This is where the story shifts from a simple battlefield victory into a profound moral dilemma. It is a question that forces us to examine the terrifying, gray areas of war. When the history books recount the final, bloody push into Germany, they often speak in absolutes. They speak of entire cities reduced to smoldering ash. Take the horrific siege of Aschaffenburg, commanded by a fanatical Nazi major who forced the civilians to fight the Americans in the streets for 10 agonizing days. The U.S. response there was traditional, overwhelming, and utterly devastating. They called in massed artillery fire. They called in heavy bombers. When the smoke finally cleared after a week and a half of relentless bombardment, the city of Aschaffenburg simply ceased to exist. It was a cratered, burning ruin, utterly flattened to the ground, with thousands of civilian casualties buried beneath the rubble of their own homes.
That was the standard way of dealing with fanatic resistance. You bomb the entire grid until there is nothing left to resist. But Patton, in this specific instance, chose a completely different path. He chose to apply overwhelming, targeted terror. He didn't blanket the town in high explosives. He didn't order his men to level every single building just to be safe. He used surgical strikes, blowing apart only the specific houses where the shooters hid, putting on a display of such horrifying, concentrated violence that the fanatic defenders' minds broke before their town did. By threatening complete annihilation and demonstrating pinpoint destruction, he forced a rapid surrender within hours. He didn't destroy the town to save it. He terrified it into saving itself. This leaves us with a chilling, uncomfortable question. Was Patton's response unnecessarily cruel? By ordering direct-fire tank shells into civilian buildings, even if they were occupied by combatants, was he violating the very rules of war he was furious at the Germans for breaking? He deliberately used the psychological terror of heavy armor against a civilian population center. Or, in the brutal, unflinching mathematics of war, was his response actually an act of dark mercy? By unleashing concentrated, localized violence and refusing to engage in a slow, protracted, house-to-house bloodbath, he saved thousands of American lives. But more surprisingly, he saved thousands of German civilian lives as well. The town was left largely standing. The people survived. By showing the absolute worst of American military might up close, he prevented the total annihilation of a city. It is a paradox that defines the horror and complexity of modern conflict. Sometimes, the only way to stop a massacre is to threaten an apocalypse. Sometimes, the most brutal tactic is the one that spills the least blood. As the final American tanks rattle down the cobblestone streets of the secured, quiet town, the smoke continues to rise from the localized destruction. The white flags, real ones this time, still hang from the surviving windows. The fanatic commanders, the teenage zealots, and the SS diehards are marching toward prisoner-of-war camps. The surviving civilians, terrified but alive, begin to sweep the debris from their doorsteps. Patton's Third Army pushes ever deeper into Germany, leaving behind a profound, terrifying lesson in survival. By choosing calculated terror over blind annihilation, He broke the will of a suicidal enemy without wiping an entire city off the map. It was a brutal, ugly, and uncompromising strategy. But it ended the dying in a matter of hours rather than weeks. It leaves us looking back at the scarred walls of that German town and the heavy decisions made in the chaos of the Second World War. Was Patton saving lives or proving a point through fear? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you were commanding an army faced with a fanatical enemy hiding behind civilians, what choice would you make? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more untold, intense stories from the darkest corners of history. Until next time.